Hi, class. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Peter Parcelletti. I'm in the educational doctorate program here at Concordia St. Paul, with the emphasis in strength and conditioning. I'm going to be presenting this week on efficacy of fitness organizations' online certifications. And to be perfectly transparent, there's not a lot of direct research that I can actually evaluate to determine this, the efficacy of online certifications. So we're going to look at a few different things, but I wanted to kind of give you a high-level overview, what got me into this, why I thought that this was an area that I definitely wanted to pursue. Obviously, as many of us know, right, the fitness industry has been offering certifications online for quite some time, well before COVID, but obviously during COVID, things got accelerated and everything went online, including academics or academia in kinesiology programs, as well as increasing the amount of online education that actually was put out there by the private sector. Ironically, those two pictures I was looking for, online education or online training, and these pulled up. These are from, I believe it's ISSA, and the bottom one there, it says how to start online training without in-person experience. Basically, which is my bottom bullet point on the left-hand side, is how to learn online, how to get certified online in online training. Right? Like, it seems like completely counterintuitive, but it's the world that we live in. So they've been offering these for quite some time. Obviously, when COVID happened, it accelerated it. So during this process, I've been teaching at Los Angeles City College since 2014. A lot of our career technical education programs, personal training, certifications. I'm currently working on developing a lot of curriculum, including personal training degree, as well as a pre-athletic training, degree, as well as a pre-athletic training or pre-sports med certificate of achievement. And this is essentially trying to get students involved into long-term at our junior college level. So I'm always kind of tinkering around with this idea about the online side of it, because you would think, as we all know, it's not that effective. But prior to that, actually not prior, while I was working there, I was working as an adjunct, at Los Angeles City College. I worked for about 10 years in corporate wellness for a company called Optum Workplace Wellbeing, which is formerly Plus One. At one point, we had close to 300 plus accounts, or around 300 accounts in fitness center and wellness management for Fortune 500 companies. So we were doing corporate wellness. And the unique thing, if you've never worked in corporate wellness, about it is that you are a company, you're hired to come in and manage their fitness and wellness solutions. It depends on what the company wants to buy, first and foremost. Secondly, you as an organization, this third-party organization, have to adapt to the cultural dynamics of all of the different workplaces. So even though we're all workplace well-being, as an example, we have, financial, let's just say some companies in New York in the financial sector. And I sometimes still feel like I work there. I don't work there anymore because of COVID. I was laid off. But financial companies, Bay Area technology companies, and I live in Los Angeles, so motion picture studio organizations and companies. And so everyone is unique and everyone is different depending on what the client wants to buy. And you also have to adapt or adopt the client's culture as well. So you can't have consistency, and this was an area of opportunity for me. I was working as the director of education, overseeing how we implemented our personal training protocols and programs. We didn't have any consistency or consensus in how we did that. We left it up to the sites. I saw a unique area of opportunity to really just get us on the same page so that we could have some baseline perspectives that a client's experience was going to be similar, whether as a financial company in New York versus a West Coast motion picture studio company. We didn't want, and I, as the director of education, wanted to make sure that the experience was consistent and certainly was high quality. So we only could provide online education, however, because We had locations all over the country and even some internationally, and we did not have the financial bandwidth nor the personnel bandwidth to have personalized trainings happen on the various sites. It was just too cost prohibitive. So we had to actually embrace online education. And in the next slide, I'll talk about some of the partnerships we had. But though we partnered with certification agencies to certify our staff, to upskill our staff in a consistent approach that we then expected our staff to utilize when they were working with clients at the various locations across the country. However, I started looking at the efficacy of this early on. I started looking at how effective is online training? Because what I was discovering as we were rolling this out, we were getting feedback from certain sites that were telling me that they were not implementing. As an example, we implemented functional movement screen level 1 and level 2. They were not, and we expected that once you became certified, you were going to implement that FMS as part of the initial client consult whenever you're going to meet, let's do a movement screen, let's do the motivational interview, let's set your goals, et cetera, et cetera. So the initial client consultation had to have an FMS, and that was a policy, a functional movement screen. And what we were hearing was that sites were not implementing it because they didn't feel comfortable, even though they had gotten certified online. So there was a red flag for me. I didn't anticipate that. And I started looking at the research, and I really couldn't find any research on the fitness side of things. I found some research on the medical side of things that said a hybrid type model where you could implement some online learning with some hands-on really worked well. And it had been embraced for quite some time, but really didn't see anything with fitness. So that was sort of the jumping off point for me. But as I got into academics through COVID, unfortunately, because of as many of us had to experience if we were working in the fitness space, a lot of jobs were lost. I transitioned into full-time academia after a position opened up, and so which I was very excited about. The academic sector obviously had to do a complete 180 during COVID, similar to what we did in the corporate wellness space. Everything had to move online, from our offerings to our programming to how we deliver services online. So the whole world was moving into online, and the fitness companies were looking at that as obviously as an area of opportunity to expand their offerings and obviously generate revenue, right? That was the goal. I had also experience working in private sector fitness, but we saw that in both of those environments, academia, corporate wellness, private sector fitness, all of this online education stuff was exploding because of COVID. And then, like I said in the very bottom there, you can become an online trainer by taking a course online. And I only, we all have our personal experiences on that, but one of the challenges that I had with the personal training program at Los Angeles City College, where I work, was flipping it around for beginner trainers, because we did a face-to-face training session where they actually for a whole semester would train a faculty member, and we had to flip it around and do it online. So I was really teaching very green students how to teach how to actually do personal training online, and they had very limited real world experience, so they couldn't translate 3 dimensions into 2D. They didn't necessarily know what to always be looking at. And so it just created a whole host of challenges that I think many of us can agree with. But again, there's no real literature on it. And that was an area of opportunity for me. So we're going to look at some research that I hope at least gives us some insight, but it certainly doesn't answer the full question of how effective is this education. All right, so we talked about the problems, right? That really it's an applied craft. The coaching and fitness training and coaching exercise really requires boots on the ground more often than not, and really getting in there and just being able to coach through experience. And many of us who first started training, we always joke, we look back at our history of training and can't believe I was training that person that way back when, and man, I knew nothing. because the barrier of entry for fitness trainers is pretty low, as we know. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later in one of our articles that we're going to review. But you have to practice. Without practice, the skills just don't get developed. So if you never really develop those with other human beings, and sometimes that happens on the job and you just get better and better and better. And as you do continuing education, you learn and learn from other practitioners that are more seasoned. That's where you start to develop your coaching prowess, your ability to how you cue things, working with visual versus auditory learners. So much of it requires experiential learning so that we can actually get better at it and be better prepared by the time we're actually in the fitness space. Like I said, we had to switch our program into an online environment, and that was really unique for us, as I said, because it was really green students who had no experience even face-to-face training. So the 2D version online really, I don't think it translated particularly well, but we were forced to do it. Certain courses that we did that we had to offer because everything got shut down. So our weight training class, I actually had to create a 100% asynchronous online weight training class. And at the bottom, you'll see the logo with Volt Athletics. We actually partnered with Volt to use that as the app that students could have access to for free in the weight training class, and they could use it. I couldn't expect students to work out because they might not have a gym accessible to them. I work in community college, so not all students are financially able to afford their own gym, and having our facility was a really, really big deal. But we weren't able to use it because we were all, stay-at-home orders here in California. So other classes actually did well, though. So yoga was not too bad. Walking for Fitness was actually a very easy course to convert because students just used a free walking app that they could download to track, and then they just had to show that to the instructor, and it worked pretty well. Obviously, the fitness industry said, well, we're all going to flip and we're going to turn everything to online. So I'll use FMS as an example. So we actually, when I was with Optum, we had them as the level 1, which was already online well before COVID. We told them we needed a level 2, a level 2 version, because I wanted to be able to make sure our employees knew how to do the corrective strategies based on the movement screen. And when a client presented with deficiencies or movement dysfunction, what could we do? How could we program? I needed them to have that. So they actually created a level, what we always joked was like 1.5. It was kind of a 2, but it wasn't quite the full 2. And they were always against doing the 2 online. And then when COVID hit, they said, because they had already actually created one for us, they went full bore and said, well, yep, we're going to do 2 online too. And obviously had to, because it made sense financially from a business perspective. So the other thing that we started to see too, that I think really impacts all of these, and I'll talk about these 2 other certifications here, the Kettlebell Concepts and IOM in a second, but many fitness pros left the industry through COVID because they all got furloughed, or the gym shut down. They had to get other jobs. So now we have a lot of folks who are in the fitness space, at least for the last year and a half, 2 years, from colleagues that I've talked to, especially at education partners. They've said, we've got all these new people that are really looking to learn. And, prior to COVID, we had a lot of more seasoned people that were, you'd always have the beginners coming in, but we just didn't have, there's a lot of demand for our certifications now. So there's an area of opportunity to upskill new trainers who had made the career shift into fitness as other trainers left the fitness space. The Kettlebell Concepts and Institute of Motion. So at Los Angeles City College, we've actually still worked with all 3 of these organizations. FMS, we embed as a quote unquote textbook into our course, so students can get certified as part of the course at a really steep discount for students, which is very generous of them. Kettlebell Concepts, if you're familiar with them or not, they were a really early on kettlebell certification company, but RKC and I guess now RKC's sort of morphed into Strong First, and IKFF, if you're familiar with competition kettlebell training, they really started to take it to another level. But Kettlebell Concepts was very excited to work with us because they're not really, they're non-dogmatic. They talk about all the different modalities. And they had an online education program that they had already built. Actually, all of their certifications were online prior to COVID. So that was also, okay, cool, take advantage of it. And the Institute of Motion they literally reworked all of their course content during COVID. And they are the company, if you're familiar with Vipers, those tubes with handles, you may have seen them. They're out of Solano Beach in basically northern San Diego here in California. But they redeveloped their entire curriculum to fully online with discussion boards and using a little bit more of a model that we would in academics or in academia, where we're sort of using Blackboard or Canvas, whatever you might be using if you're teaching as well. They did the same thing, so they really could make a little bit more rich environment for online learning. So that was an interesting thing. And the final thing is, one of the conversations, we'll talk about questions that I kind of want to throw out there that you're going to all be answering, hopefully, if you like my topic. And it was really the financial side of it, because so much of the fitness industry is in the private sector. This has always been the frustration point for me, is what happened to us in academics or in academia and kinesiology? Why are we not owning this stuff and teaching our kids this or our students this so that they're ready to go when they leave us? Instead, what's happened is the private sector has actually had to build these internal education models. And that's what I did when I was with Optum, creating this whole education model that actually used certifications as part of the backbone. So our staff would become certified. I said, well, I'm going to take that same model into the community college environment, and I'm going to embed these into our courses so that students are actually getting not only the practical skills, and we can spend more time than like an FMS is a one-day workshop. We can spend the whole entire 16 weeks and really take care of them feeling proficient once they complete their lab work in the certifications that we've partnered with. So it's just a unique opportunity, but the fitness industry has been there the whole time doing this. And when they said, hey, we can put this stuff online, now we're looking at, once you record it and recoup all your costs from the production side of it, now it's all profit. And so I don't know what kind of incentive will be there to kind of move back into the face-to-face. And I've heard Institute of Motion has shared with me, they haven't really seen the demand. FMS is going out that last year, they started going out doing more live events. So I anticipated it all coming back towards the face-to-face, but the online stuff is here, and it's going to be here for probably ever. The weight training class that I currently teach, this is the last semester, the online weight training, the last semester that'll be offered online. We're no longer doing it. We really need people to come back to the bricks and mortar facilities that the taxpayer has invested in the community college system in in California. So we're really working hard to try and get more students back to campus. So there's that. All right, so let's get into the research. What does the research actually say? First and foremost, most of the research around the education side of things is typically qualitative. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, but just to reiterate, qualitative versus quantitative being more statistics, and that's a lot of our field is around performance, strength, especially I'm in the emphasis of strength and conditioning. So that really is a big deal from a strength coach perspective. How can I make my athletes perform better by jumping higher, moving faster, being stronger, being able to lift more volume long term over the course of their career in college sports, versus the qualitative is really going to be structurally designed for discovering interpersonal or interdynamic stuff, the way people think about something. Sometimes qualitative gets a big knock in our space, right? How can we use qualitative to really, it's not numbers, it's not metrics, it doesn't show me someone's jumping higher or moving faster, but it does tell you about what they're thinking and feeling, and it's typically used in education, sociology, and so this is what we're going to see for most of the research that we're looking at is all qualitative in design. There is, to this day, I'm not aware of any online certification research in the fitness space. So this is a huge gap. I'm kind of excited because this might be an area of opportunity for me to move forward with my problem of practice. And at least, look, we have an idea of what we probably think will happen, but at least to get some solid, concrete data around really the efficacy and really think twice. Let's say pandemic happens again, like let's think twice about how we're doing this, because we know based on the literature that has come out, right? Hopefully because I've started that process or expounded upon it, that it may not be the most effective approach. And we really do need to look at using resources in a different way for better outcomes. FMS actually has shared with me that they would be interested in doing some research because they do have their online courses, they have their face-to-face courses, and they actually saw a difference in the test scores, meaning the rate at which a consumer would pass was different between the online and the face-to-face. In fact, the online, there was a slightly greater likelihood, from, if I can recall correctly, of them failing more so than the face-to-face. So that was really interesting to me. But the fact that they're interested in sharing that data is very exciting for me, and it's something that I hope to foster here moving forward with my problem of practice. The other thing I had mentioned too earlier is that medicine has looked at this because they have to look at obviously with evidence-based practice in medicine, you really have to make sure your practitioners are learning accurately, especially if you're going for license examinations, and there has to be a certain amount of hands-on work that gets done. And there's been some good research in that area, really looking at hybrid models. So let's move on into our research and have a little discussion about this. And so the first article that I pulled was this virtual versus blended design. And the way the authors looked at this, they called it the virtual versus blended learning approach to higher education during the COVID-19 pandemic, the experiences of sport and exercise science student cohort. And this was in 2022, so it's relatively recent, which is exciting. Asynchronous, just to clarify, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, is like we're doing in this coursework, meaning you jump in, you do your work when you can, you have due dates that you have to get it done by, but there's really no interaction. There's no live classes, there's no virtual live classes either, meaning there's no Zoom. That's asynchronous, and that's what they called virtual in this, where blended was going to be some sort of online, but also some face-to-face. So they looked at students, this was a qualitative research design because they looked at surveys and they were looking at student satisfaction scores of a sports and exercise science programs, exercise science programs in the UK during the pandemic. They had 143 participants in their first and second year of university that actually completed the surveys, and they compared only virtual only versus blended learning course structures. So any other variation they weren't going to look at. The results ultimately found that students were more satisfied with blended learning than virtual only, which would make sense. Having some hands-on skills and learning real time. My students always tell me how important that is, but that seems to would make logical sense. Some limitations, which I thought, this first one in particular, I thought was rather ironic. The authors thought that focusing on exercise science was a limitation, which I'm glad they did, because that's the only thing I really care about for this article or for this topic. So I don't really think that was a limitation, but they do, because they said, well, maybe if it's a different type of coursework, maybe it would work better. And I understand what they mean by that, but I'm like, I don't care if you did anything but exercise science. Generally, as we know, with qualitative, there's interpretation because of surveys. There could be some survey bias. People may not answer accurately for whatever reason. They may be concerned about what people will think of the responses. So we always have to be a little bit cautious with survey studies because we can't always predict that they're 100% accurate. The authors are also asking for their perception satisfaction of the students, so what the students perceived as being satisfactory for them versus actual results. And this is where I would have loved to have seen a mixed methods approach. So maybe a little bit of quantitative in here. We should be looking at their GPA. What kind of grades did they get in these courses? So maybe there was a parallel between students who felt like they did really well, or they felt that they were satisfied with it and they had a better scoring outcome. I would have loved to have seen that versus the students who said maybe they didn't like it as much and they had a lower outcome. So there's a nice area of opportunity or to maybe kind of dig deeper in rethinking a design for this type of research. The next article, Fitness Pros Perception of Online Education. And really, they were looking at attitudes towards certification, online education, and medical fitness. And this was in 2018. This was a quantitative descriptive design. So don't be fooled. Quantitative descriptive is really qualitative. And I I've always had to look again. I had to dig it up. And, let me look at the qualitative. But it was all survey based. But sometimes they can categorize the surveys very easily so that you can use statistical analysis versus taking notes or taking a survey that isn't maybe that has various answers or fill in the blank answers. And then you have to actually do more coding. So that's the traditional qualitative approach, but the quantitative approach is still qualitative in nature, but it's a little easier to kind of run some numbers. I'll let Dr. Hamilton correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I think I'm in the ballpark on that one. So they looked at 86 alumni from A.T. Still University's Kinesiology and Human Movement program, which was 100% online. They had a graduate degree, so all of the participants at least had a master's degree or a doctorate in kinesiology. The majority had a master's degree from an accredited academic institution, which was A.T. Still. They also had an NCCA accredited personal training certification, and I apologize for that typo there. It should say NCCA. And I will talk about that because that actually was a pretty significant limitation in this design. What they found was the participants felt that the practical experience was more important in skill development than certifications in education. And this actually was counterpoint to some of the previous research that the authors had actually cited. So this was a paradigm shift, at least from their perspectives, that they thought, you know what, the participation is more important than the education that you have. The other thing that came out of this was that they really thought, as they looked into the future, that more special medical certifications are needed, perceived to be needed for the future, and which I think is really interesting with our exercise is medicine conversation, because we don't have that licensing dynamic here in our space, in the fitness space, like allied healthcare does. So it's hard to make referrals to a trainer who might just have a basic PT certification where they only had to pass with a 70% and no practical experience, and you get to go train my grandmother. So that gives me pause. I'm sure it gives you all pause too. But the barrier of entry is so significantly low in our profession that it's very difficult for allied healthcare professionals to recommend or refer, especially with exercise in medicine with that concept. So it's interesting that they're looking at that. The authors also talked about letting online universities really look and think more thoroughly about how they could embed that type of curriculum, because that wasn't one of the majors in special populations, isn't really one of the areas of focus or majors or concentrations in the degrees that they looked at. Now, of course, again, we have for limitations those survey bias, right? So sometimes they can just answer based on what they think they should be saying. There's a little bit of gray area there. The participants were all attending AT Still, right? So there's going to be inherent potential bias there. It would have been better if we got several colleges or universities with graduates from online programs instead of just one program, even though they had some different concentrations. It would have been probably a little bit more robust if we could look across the entire spectrum. And then this final 2 bullet points, and it really should be 1. I apologize. That's another typo. But the NASM CES made up about 52% of what they claim to be NCCA accredited. And for those of you that are familiar with the NCCA, that's the accrediting agency for ACSM, NASM, ACE, blanking on the others, NSCA, I think I already said, ACSM, there's a few others. And that many years ago, they said, we are all going to certify we're going to get accredited by this one organization, which requires a proctored examination at a test center and a certification that has to be renewed. And it has to be each of the exams, even though they're different organizations, have to have a certain percentage of the tests under certain domains to be NCCA accredited, and there can be no practical experience. And I know this because if anyone's familiar with Mike Boyle's Certified Functional Strength Coach, when I was working with Optimum Workplace Wellbeing, we wanted to get them in as our preferred certification, primary certification, but I said, you've got to go get NCCA accredited. That's our company policy. And they went to do it, and the NCCA said you cannot have an applied portion. It can only be test-based. So I thought that was really interesting. Now, getting back to this, the third and fourth bullet point, the CES, the Certified Exercise Specialist, is a secondary certification. It's not a primary certification, meaning you don't have to renew it. Once you get it, you have it forever. It is not NCCA accredited. This is a massive oversight on their part. And if I was doing the peer review on this article, I would have immediately spotted this and sent it right into the editor. And because this was more than half of their pool, which they alleged all had NCCA accredited. They say that literally in the top of the article. They are not NCCA accredited. And they essentially only have their graduate degree. And so this is just a huge miss in this paper, and I was really, really surprised to see. It boggles my mind how that happened. So those are what I found as limitations. Of course, what they also found as limitations, but not the last couple. Actually, these were what I thought were their limitations. All right, moving on to the next one. We've got online kin student study challenges. So this was titled Study Habits and Learning Experiences of Undergrad Students in Physical Education, Major Online Kin Courses. And this is in 2019. So this was a descriptive, qualitative, so another variation of the qualitative design. You're going to see right out of the gate, it's got tiny participation. They only got 7 students to respond to their survey query, but they were enrolled in an online lifespan motor development course at a Midwestern university. The results, they found that students had a couple of consistent issues that they coded in their notes, and they found that they found challenges in transitioning from experiential to visual learning. So there was already right out of the gate, the moment they had to go online, there was a sense of not being comfortable with this way of learning. They struggled with the use of textbooks because they often felt as though the textbook didn't match the online coursework. And then they all expressed that they had computer-based text anxieties more so than normal. In fact, many of them said that they knew the answers, but they got them wrong anyway. And they were a little bit overwhelmed with just the testing protocols that had to be put into place. For those of us that have taken exams online, that are proctored, etc., it obviously offers a different experience. And then there were also some what they called social justice and diversity sensitivity issues in discussion boards, where students weren't sharing their faces or sharing their and I struggle with this at the community college level. We're not required to put our students, we can't make students put their cameras on unless it's a movement-based course that requires performance for grading. So something like a dance course. But generally, we cannot force students because we don't know what type of home their environment is or what home environment they have, and we don't want to create a barrier for participation in our course. So students can sit there with their screens off and not really contribute. And that created also some challenges for the students because they felt like they needed a little bit more education on how to properly conduct themselves and be a little bit more sensitive to a variety of different diversity challenges that they were experiencing. So the couple of the limitations would include, obviously, again, that survey bias and then the size. This is a tiny, tiny group. We would actually want to see a much larger group. So hard to kind of take it all and apply it to the rest of the world with just 7 participants. All right. The last one, impact of COVID-19 on access to laboratories and human participants, exercise science faculty perspectives. This also was in 2022. I thought it was interesting let's look at what the faculty said about the students' experience. And again, this is another qualitative design. There was 100 participants who were all lab-based, meaning they were doing laboratory work. So a lot of it was upper division and or grad school work. So physiologists, exercise physiologists, biomechanists, or professors of biomechanics who were, and grad students who were actually running the labs. But depending on how their school responded to COVID, some of them no longer had access to the lab, or some of them did still have access to the lab. So that was the inclusion criteria You had to actually have lab access at one point. They identified, when they started coding out the notes, 3 themes that really were because of or had been impacted by the new online learning COVID environment. There was an increase in safety protocols, obviously. There was a modified lab and research procedures that had to be adjusted. And instructor workload and productivity. Instructor workload increased, productivity decreased, meaning that the research that the professors were conducting, they could not get it done nearly as much, or weren't able to get as much work done because they couldn't be in the lab with the same volume of students that they once had in the past. Obviously, there's always going to be some limitations with survey bias. But what I wanted to do was really look at what were some of the actual statements that they were coding and looking at that came out of this that followed these 3 themes. So let's move over to the next slide here. And this will be the faculty perspectives without access to lab spaces. So they lost the access to lab spaces, and you see the 3 themes on the left in blue. This is taken directly out of the research. And I highlighted in yellow, the very top there under sample quotations. Labs were fully online, so it was difficult to replicate the practical experiences students should be getting through remote teaching. So I highlighted essentially all of the things that related to students. The other things that you can read them here, but that weren't highlighted had more to do with the faculty experience themselves, which I wasn't as interested for this particular topic. The next one, my normal use of student interns in our human performance lab was eliminated, thus potential research efforts were delayed. So there was maybe less participation by students. They couldn't get as much experience. The third one, students didn't have access to equipment that they needed. Videos on YouTube only do so much, and I wasn't able to help teach them skills that they would need in future, i.e. blood pressure, exercise, test administration, anything that requires a piece of equipment. We all know the variety of things, toys that we get to play with. If you can't play with it, it becomes very difficult for the students to be proficient and understand how to use it just by watching online or reading about it in a textbook. The last one that I highlighted here, it says labs were fully online, so it was difficult to replicate the practical experiences students should be getting through remote teaching. And obviously that's a challenge for instructors that we've had. All of us have gone through, but you could tell, or they felt as though the students were just simply not getting the appropriate experiences because we have an applied environment that we need to be proficient in. All right, let's look at the last screenshot that I grabbed, and this will be the faculty perceptions who did have access to lab. So the very first quote there in yellow says, creating lab groups that came in at different times so we could have less students in the lab at a time. So that's good, but that creates challenges, meaning you're not going to be able to get as much experience. You're going to have to adjust. Protocols make, COVID protocols, having less people in the room. Maybe students aren't getting the same exact amount of quality time that they should be getting because of these restrictions. The next quote, many students needed to revise their projects or adjust them to be COVID policy proof, which slowed them down. That makes pretty good sense. The third highlight that I have there inside this quote, it says the most frustrating part has been mentoring students in data collection, as they miss so much of the data collection experience when they are relying on remote data collection. So just really the practical experiences with just the data collection, you could imagine, would be challenging for a faculty member. If they're doing it remotely, you're not there to answer questions real time. You're not able to actually, handhold and allow them to learn from their mistakes, so that they're not hopefully going to make those mistakes when they're actually working eventually on their own. And then the final and fourth one, that faculty were willing to teach twice so that all students could still have hands-on lab experience. Also, we found one alternative location so that all athletic training students could have labs at the same time, grouping 10 to 12 students in a lab space in another building. So now you're doing double work. And now you're a faculty member who's maybe more fatigued. Maybe your quality of education might be potentially suffering. So you're having to do more work. And I thought that was an interesting dynamic for the instructors, even though we were looking at what they perceived as the challenges for the students, having to do more work to do the same amount of work that you've done in the past that can be defeating, and it can impact the student experience as well. So definitely an interesting. It's interesting to read the qualitative actual statements, and as you go through some of these designs, you're going to actually read paragraphs from different participants and what their feelings and sensations were about their experiences, and that really is a great example of the qualitative dynamic and how that can have an impact on us when we're looking at certain aspects of kinesiology, but in particular experience with learning. All right, we're at 40 minutes. I'm sorry this took me so long. I hope you're still with me. I hope you didn't, well, maybe you fast forwarded me. That's fine. I want to thank you all. We've got some great questions. I'm really actually excited to look for and looking forward to your participation in the discussion. I'm anticipating getting in there and responding to your questions and really facilitating this. There's a lot of area of opportunity to learn more. And again, we don't have that direct certification information, certification data that I think we would like to have to really definitively define if this is a rational approach for certifications to be online, or maybe it does need to be a hybrid. As we looked at it, some of the research said we really do need a hybrid, and how would that change how private industry, distributes or delivers their education? And certainly for organizations that have internal education, how they're going to apply that and how they're going to allocate resources to make that happen more effectively, so that whether it's students and or employees really get to learn and apply in a safe, practical way with their client populations. Look forward to your posts. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks so much.